Are you able to record? Amazing. Hi guys, my name is Martha. I'll be doing today's workshop on self-improvement for the St. Andrews Pre-EUDC Training Academy. So a couple of things in terms of sort of housekeeping. The first is just a bit of an introduction. I'm one of the Copenhagen EUDC DCAs this year. I've been debating for 5 years, and within those 5 years, I've won EUDC, I've paneled the World's Grand Final, and I've broken it over 100 competitions. But I never did schools debating. I never did world schools in particular, which I think has something of a coaching culture that people sort of be intimidated to debate against. And I guess that's just to say that I don't really think there are prerequisites or requirements you need to have done to do well at debating. The way you approach improving and the way you approach trying to become a better debater is probably going to be a more indicative thing in terms of how you're likely to do. Secondly, in terms of just the usual sort of caveats, um, broadly three things on this. The first is that this presentation is largely based on what's worked for me, and that might not be what works for everybody. I would recommend experimenting with things to see what actually works best for you in your particular circumstances. The second is I would note my experience is pretty much exclusively with British parliamentary debating, and that means it might not always be applicable to other formats. I do still think this advice will help if you're debating in 3v3, but you might want to adapt certain things if they're not relevant in the way they're sort of being presented. The third is while this workshop will give a broad overview of how to improve in general, I don't really intend to do a deep dive into any specific areas beyond a certain amount. There are a lot of workshops out there in terms of like how to give better deputy speeches or how to matter file or how to get better at sports debates or specific things. Some of those have already been part of this academy. And so if some part of what I'm saying doesn't quite make sense to you, I would recommend finding a more specialized workshop later on that specific topic. I'm certainly happy to recommend some if people really want to improve it, like whips or something specific, but I'm not intending to delve into specific skills very much. Just try to identify common problems and how to solve them and how to approach solving problems in general. And the final thing to say is that this presentation will make a couple of assumptions at the outset. The first is that you are or will be doing debates, whether that's spars, your society's training, competitions, etc. And the reason I make that assumption is because debates are a good way to get better at debating. But a lot of the advice in this will be structured at how to make doing debates better for your improvement. Because I think people have a habit of trying to brute force spar debates or competitions and just do lots of debates in the run up to a big major in an attempt to improve. I would suggest that's not a very strategic way to improve because you're not really thinking about what you're trying to work on with each debate, what you're trying to improve, what you're bad at, and how you can be better at it. And so, in my assumption that you're going to be doing at least some debates, the advice will be tailored to how to make those debates useful for you and how to make sure you're kind of improving on and reflecting on those debates every time. The second assumption is that you sometimes struggle to identify what your weaknesses might be, and therefore you struggle to know what you should be doing to improve. I think most debaters can say that there are many things they're not perfect at, or there are many things that they could work on, but it's difficult to prioritize between them. And so, what this workshop should be helpful for is to help you identify what you should focus on and which things are the main factor in you losing debates right now and not being prepared in general in the way you otherwise would be. And the third is that you are, in some sense, working towards something. So that might be that you're going to the upcoming EUDC or ABP. It could be Sophia Worlds, or maybe you've got trials for your society and you'd like to put your best foot forward. I think that this presentation is still going to be useful, even if this last assumption that you are preparing for something is not true. But you should bear in mind the implicit deadline that comes with some of my advice and adjust accordingly if you're not someone who's actually operating on that deadline. Okay, so before sort of going through the structure of what I intend to talk about, I want to just give a piece of sort of theory or a theoretical framework to how I view debates that I think is helpful, at least for this presentation, in thinking about how to improve at debates. I think there are broadly two ways that you can look at debating, which are different, but to me have always existed on like two different levels with the same debate. The first is to suggest competitive debating is an analytical game where you select and prove the winning case to your side, and that means that you win. The second way of looking at it is that competitive debating is a persuasion game of convincing the judges on the panel in your room that you've beaten the other three teams in the room. The thing with these two definitions is that they're not mutually exclusive or incompatible in any way, but I think people can get hung up usually on the first without really considering the second, and I would suggest that is a mistake. My view and how I've often thought of it is that debates exist on these two levels at the same time. There is the ideal debate, which is if you took all of the arguments in the room and you wrote them down and gave them to a utility processing machine, it would add them all up and get to the right outcome. And that's a debate you want to be winning. But there's also, in a different sense, the real debate, which is that your judges are human beings with biases and limitations of their understanding, with different priorities and incentives, and that three other teams in the room may have different skills or knowledge to you in the things they'll say and the way they run things, and that the debate might not always be won, or the points might not always be awarded in a way that perfectly maps onto the, hypothetical utility machine's way of doing it. I think sometimes what I've sort of had people describe the second version or of a view of debate as being is that if you're winning in that game, you're sort of scamming. You're winning because you're illegitimately convincing the panel that you've won. I would suggest that's not true exactly. It's more that I think it's good to be aware of the fact that you have a panel in front of you who are the ultimate deciders of which points you're going to get in the debate. And while trying to win the debate analytically and do so in the ideal world, you should also be trying to win the real debate. And that might mean it might affect the way you sort of try to debate clearly, the way you might try to prioritize or sell your arguments to the panel that you have, the way you might decide in some cases which arguments to run, although I don't ever do that. I know some people do. But that's just something to have in mind. Many debaters go into rooms and feel when they run 10 arguments, they think those 10 arguments should analytically win the debate. They should win the debate, and they get angry if they don't. But I think that you should be aware that you've got to convince the panel in front of you. And that's a factor that I think people need to bear in mind. So we're going to talk about three things then. The first is in terms of mindset and method when it comes to self-improvement. The second is winning the ideal debate. And the third is winning the real debate. My hope is with all of these things at the end, you'll have a bit more of a framework of how to improve and how to see what it is that's currently letting you down and what you can then do to fix that. So, part one, mindset and method. In terms of mindset, I think there are three things that are important to bear in mind when you are trying to improve. The first is, and I think it's quite important, humility. Debaters really don't like to believe that they've lost. It's quite easy and quite common for people to blame it on bad judging or rep bias, institutional bias, their partner not delivering the case correctly, other teams scamming better and like winning legitimately, or whatever. But the very first step of getting better is identifying what it is you need to work on. And you are quite unlikely to be able to do that well if you're unable to accept that you are flawed. So I think a very important part of trying to improve is to be humble and to remember that you are highly capable of losing debates and you're going to lose quite a lot of them in the coming months. Be self-critical when it comes to debates and always try to keep in mind that there is something you could have done to do better, gain more points for the debate, run a better argument, prove the argument better, beat the other teams. It is always the case that there was something you could have done to convince the judges, even if they were bad judges, to run different responses to beat another team's argument, run a smarter extension, or make sure your extension was more clearly not derivative. There's always something else you could have said or done in the speeches. I think having that in mind and knowing then that the ultimate decider of how you do in a round is you is the most important way the thing to keep in mind, I think, when it comes to this. The second thing I'd say is it's very important to learn from your mistakes. So a bad debater takes a loss as either like a personal insult or as a critical blow to their self-esteem that means they want to give up entirely and never want to debate again. Neither of those is very useful. Every mistake you end up making is some kind of opportunity to learn. And it is also a very direct signifier of where you should be focusing your attention in your future training or in debates that follow. A good debater learns from their mistakes and avoids making the same mistakes in the future, even if they'll inevitably make some different ones as time goes on. And the third thing I would say is just to keep the end in sight. So especially if you're preparing for some kind of major, a major's prep season is a marathon and not a sprint. And you should be very much focusing on the focus line, on the finish line, and not on the individual stops along the way. I often speak to debaters who don't want to try new things at competitions or in spars in case they lose the debate or they don't break as a result of it. So people who know they should try out new speaking combinations with their partner, but they don't want to suffer the short-term cost of maybe not breaking at the upcoming tournament. I would suggest, though, with respect, that it's a slightly short-sighted way of looking at things that isn't particularly helpful if you are trying to achieve something at the end of a season. Every debate you end up doing between now and Euros or ABP or Worlds or Australs, is a step towards getting you where it is you need to be. It's not really an end in itself. And so it's kind of a waste of time to sacrifice potentially doing quite well in the future for something that is quite meaningless now. A lot of teams overperform in prep season and then they don't break at the major. A lot of teams don't break at prep comps, but then make majors grand finals. One very good example of that is in the Vietnam Worlds prep season, Stanford A didn't break at the Oxford IB, and weren't necessarily performing very highly in the prep season, but then made the Open Grand Final, and Tejas on that team was top speaker. So it isn't the case that like I'm talking about negligible cases or people who like don't break a prep comps and then they make the PDQ at Euros and call it a day. In a very real sense, there are people who have done incredibly well at majors because they have been able to prioritize the major over their ego or smaller comps and the meaning of those things. And I just think it's always better to be in the latter camp who like the latter camp in terms of those who don't break and then do very well at majors than it is to be someone who breaks at like you know various online comps in the run up, but then doesn't break at the competition itself. So I do think bearing in mind that you're working towards something and that you might sacrifice certain comps along the way to try new things is the better thing to do. And it's just good to keep in mind that that's what you're actually aiming at. Um, I will say though, I have a few caveats to that. As someone who can be sometimes self-critical in maybe a less positive sense and a less productive sense, I would just say three things about trying to follow those rules and bear that in mind when you're approaching this. The first is just not to let perfect be the enemy of good. So I see quite a lot of people set a very high bar for themselves, and one of them was me. Not just in debating, but just in terms of how much like prep they should be doing, how many spars they should be doing or how many workshops they should be watching. And then they beat themselves up for not being able to do it and falling behind. They end up giving up on the plan altogether because they feel like they're so behind, there's no point starting. I don't think you should do this. Consistency is very much better than perfection. And anything worth doing is worth doing by half or worth doing poorly. It's a lot better to watch four workshops than none, even if you aimed to watch 40. So I just think you should try and do what you can, even if it's not as much as you're hoping for, and adjust your expectations for yourself as time goes on. The second is I think that you should try to set realistic goals. If you set ludicrous goals for yourself, like spending 8 hours a day doing spars or watching 30 workshops a week, you are very clearly not going to fulfill them. I think there's a recent serious post, someone was asking if you are willing to spend 10 hours a day doing debating or prepping for debating for months, how should you spend that time? And the vast majority of people in the comments have said you should be spending most of that time not debating. Because if you try to spend 10 hours a day debating, you will not be able to. It's not realistic. And if anything, it'll just make you miserable because you're not able to do it. But all that kind of thing is going to make you do is feel bad about yourself. You keep setting bars you are unable to reach. So instead, I think you should be setting realistic expectations for your time. You should set very specific goals based on areas that you need to focus on the most, not just general sort of I will prep debating. And you should adjust your plans over time to make sure that you are being realistic about the time that you have and how you're going to spend it. And the third thing I would say is please get a life. Like it is not healthy for anybody to spend 8 hours a day just thinking about debating, and obsessing over it that much will kill you. I would suggest anyone who is trying to improve very fast at debating or trying to go to a major and break at that major should also pick up one or two hobbies that are not competitive or where the fact it makes you feel good is not contingent on some kind of competitive outcome. Um, Going to the gym is great. And I think the thing about going to the gym that's very good is that you can set goals that you can try to strive for, but those goals aren't competitive. So you achieving it isn't like zero sum with other people. You're not competing with other people. It's not like debating in any sense like that, but it is something that can make you feel good and that you can aim for and kind of feel good about how you're doing and that isn't related to debating. For me, I did a lot of cross stitching last year, like embroidery and stuff. Other people, I think, go for pints with their non-debating friends. All of those things are good uses of your time. I just would suggest you should prioritize in addition to trying to improve debating, because half the battle in the run up to a major is just kind of staying sane enough for all of or any of this stuff to work, and that requires spending like some of your time doing literally anything else. So I would push you to also pick up other things that are going to keep you sane in the process, so that you're not just locked in a room crying, trying to watch 10 workshops a day. When it comes to method, I would say three things in terms of how I think you should tangibly approach trying to improve. The first thing I would say is the quality is very much better than quantity here. So what I mean is there are quite a lot of very good workshops which will recommend you do certain exercises or watch a couple of specific videos in order to get across the point they're trying to make about what a good debater doing a certain thing looks like. I would say it's much better to watch one or two workshops in a week and really focus on those things, really follow the advice, try to implement it, go back and watch sections if you need to, than it is to watch 10, but not really take detailed notes or not really comprehend or implement those things beyond watching the debates, watching the spars, watching the workshops once. A similar thing I think can be applied to spars, because as I've said, I think very many people will try to sign up for as many spar debates as possible in order to keep practicing debating and try and improve in time for a major. But I don't think that brute forcing, like just doing debates over and over again, is a thing that's going to actually help you improve at anything. If anything, it can also be quite bad in terms of your entrenched bad habits that you have without really questioning them. So I think what a better thing to do is when you're doing those debates or when you go to competitions, later in this presentation, I'll have various ways I think to reflect on your debates and your speeches as you give them. And that is what I think would be better is to do less spars, but try to focus on what you can learn and improve from each of them. And when you are doing a spar debate, to know what it is you're working on at that time, whether it is that you're trying to, for worlds, I think different circuits can judge differently. So, for example, you can try to see how a judge from a different circuit to you judges you or what they think of you and how you might be able to adapt to that. You might just pick a topic that you're very bad at. I used to brute force closing government. I just did a lot of closing government spars because I was very weak at CG when it came to strategy. And I was worse at whips than I was at deputy speeches. So I kept doing CG until I got better at it. That's something you can do. Equally, it might be that you're really trying to work on your style, or you're really trying to work on your structure, or you're really trying to work on your weighing, your rebuttal, things like that. And that's the thing you're prioritizing in that spar. All of those are very good things to be focusing on, but I think that essentially spars should be focused. Spars should be based on your desire to improve something or to put yourself in a position where something is difficult and try to work out how to get out of that position over and over again until you're better at it. But I do think that every spar you do should have a point. So doing millions of them without a point is, I think, much worse than doing less, but having a purpose to all of them. The second thing I would say is ask for and track feedback that you are getting. So the first thing I think you should do is write down feedback on yourself after your own speech every time you sat down. Then I think you should listen to the OA to see what the judge thought of your case and of your speech. You'll be able to get a lot of criticism about your speeches from that OA. And then I think you should go ask the judge specific questions about what you should have done better. So, depending on what you're working on, or depending on what you think based on your own feedback that you didn't do very well, or from the OA, what doesn't seem you did very well, you should go ask specific questions about whether or not certain things worked so you know what it is that you didn't do as well in that particular debate. At the end of every round, you should have a list of things that you should have done better and try to make sure that you know what it is that you're, not so great at and try and record those things over time. The last thing I would say is I think it is important to record everything when it comes to feedback. And in particular, I'd say to try to figure out are there certain motion types you're not doing very well on? Are there positions you're not doing very well on? Are there like, is it when it's round five, maybe the pressure gets to you and you're not doing as well as you are in the earlier rounds? Maybe you're just in stronger rooms, so you're not doing quite as well. Or is it certain, topics that you're very weak on or you lack knowledge on? I think it's good to record all of those things in addition to, how you do in a debate and all of the feedback that you got. So you can start trying to see trends across time and see what it is that needs your attention the most. So here's my absolutely by no means perfect feedback tracker for Glasgow EUDC that I used from end of March until the end of the prep season. I think I did something like 85 or 90 speeches or something in that time. I went to a fair number of comps and I did a fair few spars as well. And I think I'm counting the like however many 12 or 13 Euros speeches in that number. Um, and if I was to do this again, I would also change a couple of things about the structure of this. Probably I would add in a column just for what the topic area of the motion was. I think that would be quite helpful. But broadly, what I had was I put what the round was. So, was it a particular spar? Was it a round at the tournament? Who my teammate was? What the motion was that we were debating? What position I was speaking? Almost always second. I don't really do firsts, but was I in whip or was I in deputy or was I, where was I? And then what position we took in the debate, as well as any feedback I got either from myself when I was criticizing the speech after the fact, or from the person who was judging the round and what they thought we could have done, what was missing, what could have been done better. Um, I did find this very helpful because I was able to tell if I was doing better at something than I had been doing before, partly just because I could say, well, I wasn't as good. I wasn't feeling as good about my Gov Whip speeches at the start of this, but then I actually ended up feeling much better about my Gov Whip speeches, 2 months later. And a lot of the things I thought I was struggling with in terms of like I wasn't doing great weighing into my opening. I didn't really feel like I was being that precise in terms of the language I was using, and I didn't think that I was always doing a very good job not wasting time. I felt like I improved those things over time, and I could look back at the things that weren't going so well and see how far I'd come in relative terms. So that's very helpful. I also think just knowing if it's just a one-off that you have a certain problem, or if it's something that has come up like every round or a lot of rounds that you're doing, it's a good way to see how prevalent something is for you, so you know what to target and what to focus on. But broadly, this is how I approached it in my kind of bootstrapped spreadsheet that I made. And I do think it's very helpful to at least be tracking your feedback so that you know what's happening in terms of trends. I really think everybody should track their feedback as much as possible. Okay, that's kind of wrapping up sort of the mindset and method section of this presentation. Part two is when it comes to winning the ideal debate, which is to say, analytically picking the correct case, proving the correct case, impacting the correct case, such that you have to win the debate. Why do people lose the ideal debate? Broadly, I think there are four reasons. The first is due to lack of knowledge about the topic. The second is poor strategy. The third is poor analysis. So they pick the right strategy, but they're not proving the case. And the fourth is poor responsiveness. So, firstly, in terms of lack of knowledge, do you know enough about the topic at hand to generate arguments, let alone arguments that can win the debate? The problem that happens to people here is they just don't know enough. So they aren't really able to identify how to win the debate or which arguments are going to win them the debate because they don't know enough about what's actually happening in this particular area. They're kind of just lost. And so the solution I would say to this is broadly three things. The first, and this applies to most IR debates, politics debates, or anything that someone has read a newspaper article about and decided to set emotion on, is to read the news. But when it comes to reading the news specifically, I would do three things. The first is to buy a subscription to a major international newspaper. A lot of people like The Economist. The Economist is very good in terms of having quite a broad array of news. Personally, it's a bit expensive for me because it's like 30 quid a month or something. So I prefer the New York Times, which is only €2 a month, or I think it's maybe $2, but it's very much not expensive on a monthly basis. Download that on your phone and turn notifications on, and then make an effort to at least read what the headlines are when they're coming in, because things like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the BBC, and the Guardian stuff, if you turn your notifications on for them, they will all update you every time there is some kind of major headline. And so just try to read those as they come in at least. If you do that, you'll at least have some idea of what's happening, even if you don't know the details. Second thing I would do is subscribe to a daily newsletter. So it's something like the CFR Daily Brief. Otherwise, a lot of newspapers have one. So again, the New York Times has a daily one. A lot of papers have some kind of daily one. I would try to read it every day, but if you do fall behind, I would say don't worry too much. Just start again when you can. There's actually not that much value to trying to, go back on a backlog of news articles, because the thing about the news, it changes every day, quite new in that respect. But the other thing is that if there's a situation that's developing, you miss 5 days, you start reading again. Probably you can quite easily catch up by just reading the initial article, which will explain the things that you've missed. So very much try to read a daily newsletter. But if you can't, just try to get back on the horse as soon as possible if you fall off. And the third thing I would say is do actually read the news, or whatever that means for you. Listen to news podcasts when you can, and try to get into a routine of doing so pretty regularly. Again, if you can't, I think the first two, in terms of seeing the notifications regularly and having some kind of newsletter that you read every or most days, are just going to be enough to mean that you have some familiarity, you can get by. But it's going to be more helpful for you if you are reading the news most days. And so I would just recommend try to build time for that in your routine. But I would also say try to read, one newspaper. If you try to overdo it, it's unlikely you're going to end up doing anything. So pick one or two papers that you like and just try to read them most or every day. I do think people tend to be a bit overzealous and be like, I'm going to subscribe to 10 newsletters, or I'm going to pick 5 podcasts and I'll listen to all of them every day. And I will always be on top of the news, and eventually I'll be plugged into the matrix and see everything. But in all honesty, if you do that, you will never read them. So the point is to try to pick a digestible amount of content so that you will actually build it into your routine, but that you won't just get overwhelmed and stop doing it entirely. That's it in terms of reading the news. The second thing I'd say is that there are a significant amount of debate and content workshops, which are very helpful and very good. What I've done here is I've linked spreadsheet basically. I think it's called the Debate Resources Compilation or something. It's very good. There's a lot of workshops in it. They're all sorted by sort of who did it and what the topic is. And there's a lot of content workshops which are very, very helpful and quite specific in some cases. The only thing about that one is it hasn't been updated since just after Vietnam World, so about a year and a half ago, but it is still very, very detailed, and there's a lot of things that you can opt for there. I'll post the slides in the Discord after this, and I'll get them out to the description of the YouTube as well. So it should be possible for you to access this. And I think it doesn't really matter that it's a little bit out of date because there are so many as to be very, very helpful. And the third thing I would recommend in terms of like fixing your lack of knowledge is in general to read widely and read critically. I have on various occasions drawn arguments for debates from disparate and like very weird pieces of media that happened to sort of spark something for me, and then I had an idea. There was a time I won like a counterfactual relationships debate with an argument that I got because I'd been watching Bridgerton. And so like there's many things like that where things that you are consuming or reading and stuff might not seem directly tied to, generating arguments for debating. But the point is that if you are reading things pretty widely and you get exposed to a lot of different kinds of ideas and perspectives, and you are reading critically, you will be able to ultimately draw on those things when it comes to generating arguments or coming up with ideas. I think all of those can be helpful in terms of fixing maybe a lack of knowledge. And then after the debate, the thing you want to be asking yourself is, what knowledge would I have needed to win the debate? Or what knowledge would I have needed to generate an argument? And that is the kind of thing that you should be tracking, knowing and being aware of, and seeing, well, okay, it seems in a lot of these finance debates or a lot of these religion debates, I just don't know enough to be able to win the debate. And that's what kind of tells you that what you probably need to go work on is one of those things. That's a knowledge gap you'll need to prioritize fixing in that respect. Secondly, and second problem I think is very big with people is having a poor strategy. So the question here is, does the case that you have selected in prep logically allow for you to win the debate? If it doesn't logically allow for you to win the debate, it is impossible for you to win. You've already lost from prep, even if you fully proved the case. There are kind of two problems that you can face in terms of having poor strategy. The first is that your case is not capable of logically winning the debate. If you have fully proven it and it is fully bought by the panel, there is no world in which the case that you've picked has logically won the debate. So the solution then, or one of solution to this that is helpful, is that there are certain strategies that, if proven, logically have to win the debate. So I guess one way of solving this problem is just to always try and find one of these. Credit where credit's due. This is not my list. I took it from Uday Kamath's workshop on how to win debates, which is also a very good workshop, which I'd very much recommend if you are trying to improve. The first benefit, or sorry, the first strategy you can go for then is just picking a huge benefit or a huge harm. If you identify a harm or benefit so big that it has to outweigh everything else in the debate, it's a case that logically, if fully proven and executed right, has to win. So for example, in debates about war, most teams attempt to prove that their side ends the war faster, because if proven, that is the biggest and most important impact in the debate. Immediately, you prevent a huge number of deaths. You have less people suffering life-altering injuries. People no longer have to live in constant fear, and the country can start to rebuild. And it's very easy then to take that argument in a debate on war and show why on scale and why on severity and why on, short-term and long-term, it has to win the debate because of the nature of what that impact is. The caveat, of course, here is firstly that not every debate is going to have a huge benefit or harm that you can take like that. And the second is it won't always be clear that it does automatically win the debate and outweigh every other argument. So you do still need to do the legwork to show that it wins the debate for you. But if you can pick a benefit or a harm that is so huge as to be something that you can absolutely use to outweigh everything else, that is a case that logically has to win. The second strategy you can opt for is to co-opt the opposition metric in the debate. So that is to say, you identify the metric that the opposition teams have set up or will set up for the debate, and you prove why your side achieves this better. So for example, in a debate about economics, if opposition runs an argument that this will lead to more investment, and in CG you prove that their side actually achieves less investment than yours, then you have flipped that argument and you logically have to win at least that pairwise comparison. Here, the caveat is just you still have to show why this beats your opening and perhaps why it beats the other team on the opposition. But it's still a very useful strategy in many cases. In particular, if you execute this against, say, the stronger team on the other side, and that team is otherwise winning the debate, this is a good way to make sure that you are able to beat them and thus win the other comparisons as well. The third strategy you can execute here is to run a non-contingent principle, which is to say you identify a way in which the policy is either immoral or morally necessary, regardless of any practical outcomes. Uh, an example here is there's quite a common thought experiment, which is a sort of follow on from the classic utilitarian do you pull the lever train one. And this one goes as follows. You are a doctor, you have 5 patients in desperate need of organs, but there are no organ donors or transplants available for them. And if they don't get those organs within, say, 5 hours, they will die. There is also a perfectly healthy patient who has come in for a checkup and has fallen asleep on the sofa in the waiting room. Do you take that patient or take that perfectly healthy person, kill them, and extract their 5 organs that happen to be a perfect match for your 5 patients? Because utilitarianism would, in theory, suggest that you should do that. It means you save more lives. But the thing that you would say against doing that is that, irrespective of the utilitarian benefit, it is immoral to kill an innocent person and violate their bodily autonomy in this way, steal their organs, take this from them when they have no involvement, they've not consented to it, and they did nothing wrong in this respect. Similar arguments can be made in favor of abortion when you talk about why, women have the right to choose what to do with their bodies and they have no obligation to carry another potential living being around, even if it is the thing that being needs in order to survive. They have the bodily autonomy and the right to not have to do so. But the point is that these are claims that there is a principled reason or some kind of right that is so strong that even if there are practical benefits to doing the other side's policy, you still ought not to do it. Or, the alternative being there's benefits not doing it, but you still ought to do it anyway. Caveats here, just the way you need to execute this. You have to prove, firstly, that the principled obligation does exist in the first place. That takes some legwork. And the second is you have to show the obligation outweighs the remainder of the debate and show why that principle is so powerful that it does outweigh all the practical outcomes. But if you are able to do so and identify that in that debate, this is a good way to win as well. And the final one that you can do that, if proven logically, has to win the debate is to run a contingent principle, which is to say you identify a principled reason for prioritizing one metric in the debate over all others, and you provide a practical argument for why your side best fulfills that metric. So, for example, the Zagreb EUDC 2014 Grand Finals, this is like the old one from 11 years ago, the team in closing opposition, Sheffield A, on the motion like this House believes the feminist movement should oppose military interventions claimed to further women's rights. Their argument is basically that the feminist movement has an obligation to prioritize areas where they can make a difference, which was their sort of principled claim. And then they showed A, that the feminist movement has no impact on the likelihood of military interventions, kind of they happen anyway. And B, that the feminist movement's reputation and their ability to enact change is irreparably harmed by the policy in the motion. They said, there's an obligation the feminist movement has to prioritize areas that can make a difference. This motion doesn't make a difference in the military interventions. It does make a difference to their ability to do anything else because their reputation is harmed. So they have an obligation now not to do this policy. The important thing with each of these strategies is that if proven, they logically must win the debate. So if from prep time you're able to identify one of these and you are then able to prove it, you will win the debates that you are in. And then the lesson here is that you need to select cases that are logically capable of winning at minimum, something that can win the debate. And then you need to just learn to think about case generation and selection in those terms. Often what people do is they just come up with a list of potential arguments or actors or things like that. The better thing to do is to be thinking of arguments that can win and to be picking cases in prep time based on can this argument win? And better, will this argument win if proven? In which case you should go with that one. The second problem people run into on strategy is that their case is just not linked back to the motion properly, so it's not relevant to the debate that they are in. The first problem being the teams run arguments that are kind of tangential to the motion itself. This is especially common when people do try to run like non-contingent principled arguments, where teams manage to prove their principle exists, but they don't prove that their principle then wins the debate for their side and loses the debate for the other side. I judged a debate recently enough at the Budapest pre-EUDC comp. The motion was this House prefers a world in which the pursuit of artificial general intelligence is abandoned. One of the opposition teams argued that AGI had consciousness and that it was principally indistinguishable from human consciousness, so we should consider it as important as human consciousness. And they did prove that argument. What they weren't able to do was show why AGI having consciousness meant that we were principally obligated to pursue the development of AGI. They had done sort of the proving of their principle. What they hadn't done was tied that principle back to the opposition side of the debate and shown why this wins the debate for that team. So they didn't do as well as they might have otherwise. The second problem that can happen here in terms of the relevance issue is teams prove things that are not contentious in the debate, or they can even just waste time on things that are not contentious in the debate. One of the places this is very common is when it comes to narrative debates, where everybody agrees on the narrative or how people learn about it, where people learn about it. And yet every team spends like up to a minute parroting the same or very similar analysis. Silly things like how the belief in an afterlife is taught to you firstly by your parents, secondly through your religious leaders, and thirdly through its portrayal in the media, such as movies. But if everyone agrees on that already, this is kind of a waste of time and it's not furthering your position in the debate. So both you should not prove things that are not a reason that the motion falls to your side, but also you should not prove things or spend time on things that everyone already agrees upon or are not contentious in the debate. So, um, sorry, ignore the solution line. That's an unfinished line saying the same thing as I've just said. After the debate, then, if you're trying to improve your strategy, you should ask yourself two questions after every debate that you're in. The first is, could our case have logically won the debate? Did we pick a case which had the capacity to win? And secondly, was there a more efficient way for us to win? Did we pick a case, but there was an easier case that was going to win more obviously? Or we picked something which maybe marginally got us the first, but there was this other very obvious argument which we forgot and didn't end up running. So, bearing those things in mind and thinking strategy in those terms is a good way to reflect on the speeches and you're giving and the debates that you're in, such that you can improve upon those things into the future. The third the problem that people run into is having poor analysis. So the question is just, are you actually proving the arguments that you're setting out to prove? The first problem people have here is that they run arguments which are not comparative. That is to say, the argument only shows why their side or their world is good, not why it's comparatively better than the other side. But debating is a comparative game. It's one that requires you in every motion to debate the values of two different worlds. The government world, where with a new policy, you will do something different versus the status quo that we currently live in. Or if it's some kind of counterfactual debate, an alternative world without organized religion versus the world we live in that has organized religion. In a narrative debate, a world with, selfishness being demonized versus selfishness not being demonized, but you're always debating two worlds and which one is comparatively better than the other. But terms like better or worse can only be evaluated when it comes to certain criteria or certain metrics. It doesn't mean anything to say that something is better in the abstract. It's always better because of something. It's better because people are happier or because more people are alive or because more people have money in their pockets to buy things. But there's a reason why something is better than something else. And so the solution here, if you're struggling with your arguments being appropriately comparative, is to identify what it is you're trying to achieve and then make sure with every argument you explain why your world achieves it better. If it is the case that you want to run that people are happier, you want to identify why, according to your arguments, people in your world are comparatively happier than they are in the opposition world, and therefore it is a better world than opposition's world is. The second problem people run into on analysis is that they have just missing burdens. And so every argument you will ever provide requires multiple premises to be proven in order for the argument as a whole to be proven. For example, if we have the motion, this House would ban cigarettes, and I stand up in Prime Minister, and my argument is that less people will die if we ban cigarettes. There are a couple of hoops I need to jump through for that argument to be proven. The first is I need to show that as a result of banning cigarettes, less people buy cigarettes. The second thing I need to prove is that less people buying cigarettes means less people smoke. It might seem obvious, but you do need to prove that. Thirdly, that less people smoke means less people get cancer, or because smoking causes cancer, or some other thing that smoking causes that gets people very sick. And fourthly, that less people getting cancer means less people die than they would in the alternative world. One problem people run into here quite often, and I say it's more common amongst like matter dumpers or spammers, is that teams conflate the number of reasons that they've given with the number of burdens that they have fulfilled. So in that example of my argument about why we should ban cigarettes, that argument wouldn't be proven if I gave 10 reasons why less people buy cigarettes, but I left all of the other burdens unproven. I didn't show why less people buying cigarettes means there are less people able to smoke, that there's not an alternative that they'll smoke instead. I didn't show why less people smoking means that less people get sick, and I didn't show why less people getting sick means less of them die. All I did was show that less people buy cigarettes. So those 10 reasons haven't done anything more than two or three reasons would for proving that particular burden. But all of these other burdens I've left unproven mean that that argument cannot be bought, no matter how many reasons I have provided. The thing to remember, I think, is that every argument you ever make is only ever going to be as strong or as persuasive to the panel as its weakest link. So the least proven burden is the thing that dictates how persuasive your argument actually is in terms of how proven it is. I would therefore bear in mind thinking about your arguments in terms of the burdens required or the analytical gaps required to believe for that argument to be proven. And then you will be able to sort of run more robust arguments as a result. But then the solution when you're trying to approach that problem is just ensuring that each of your arguments have met each of their internal burdens. Part of the doing of that means identifying what the internal burdens are to make sure the argument is in fact proven. The third problem people have when it comes to poor analysis, and the final one I'll talk about here, is that they're missing impacting. So many teams take for granted the impact that they are running is good or bad, and many teams take for granted that their impact is important. For example, in debates in the criminal justice system, teams often will explain that, as a result of the policy in question, more criminals will be locked up versus less criminals will be locked up in the status quo. The problem is that that argument is not prima facie good or bad. There are people who would say that more people being locked up is a good thing, and that's a benefit for that side because, people are more likely to commit crimes again if they committed crimes in the first place. So locking them up means you prevent future victims getting hurt. Or maybe you believe that there's a rehabilitative function to prisons. You're more likely to reform people if they stay in prison for longer, because you can keep an eye on them for longer, and then they'll also commit less crimes. Or you might say that we need hefty sentences and we need there to be big threatening sentences if people commit crimes because that's what deters people from committing crimes. And all of those would be reasons why people going to prison more or for longer might be a good thing. But equally, you could say people going to prison for longer is a bad thing, that you're more likely to get caught up in gang violence or addicted to drugs that mean that you will have much worse connections and more likely to commit crimes you get out as a result of your time in prison. You might say that, the fact that being out of the workforce for so long means you lose access to skills or knowledge of your industry. Plus, being a felon means that you're unlikely to be rehired by a lot of places. And if you've been locked up for a very long period of time, you're more likely to be seen as dangerous, all of which make it really hard for you to reintegrate into society. Those would be reasons why it might actually be a very bad thing to lock people up in the criminal justice system for longer. And so I think that's maybe a more obvious case where it really isn't clear whether an outcome like that is objectively good or objectively bad. But a lot of the time, teams don't explain why their argument is good or bad in terms of its impact. And additionally, I think many teams don't explain why their impact is important. So maybe you do explain, you lock people up for longer, and this is good because they're less likely to commit crimes when they come out because, of the kind of rehabilitation we have. And that's good because you help future victims. But if you don't explain why the impact of helping future victims is important, it's difficult to know why we should prioritize that either, absent a direct explanation of it. So the solution to this problem is that you should always be explaining why the outcome of your argument is either good or bad, and why it is important. Both of those are necessary conditions for your analysis to be doing something in the debate, to be seen to be important, and an impact that should be valued. So after the debate, when trying to improve your analysis, you should be asking yourself, firstly, did we prove our argument? As we're listening to the OA, does the chair think we proved our argument? Are they noticing problems that we didn't notice? But also, were we uncomparative? Were we leaving burdens unproven? Did we miss our impacting in a way that made the case less persuasive? These are all problems that you should be looking out for at the moment you sit down from your speech, and also in the OA and when you ask for feedback from the judges after the fact. And the final problem in this section as to why people lose the ideal debate is because they have poor responsiveness, which is to say, have you responded to the other teams in a way that allows you to defeat their arguments? The first kind of problem people have here is that they're not really responding to the other team's arguments at all. The first of those examples can look like just not actually giving any responses. And at that point, you're definitely not defeating their argument because if you haven't shown any reason why their argument's not true, it's going to be credited as true. There is quite a tendency to not do rebuttal these days, which I think is bad. So if you don't give any responses, you're clearly not going to be doing very well here. The second way that this can manifest is in criticism rather than responses, which is to say, accusing the other team of asserting their argument or saying, well, this is clearly not true, but not actually spending the time to unpick the logic and show why it's not true, or show why that assertion is in fact false and means the reality is the opposite of what the other team is saying. You should be providing responses to disprove the logic of other people's claims, not just kind of observing that they've not made their arguments very well. Because the latter kind of response isn't going to really do much for you in debates. So getting better at rebuttal often means getting better at providing reasons why other people's arguments are untrue in a way that means you defeat their arguments rather than just sort of pointing at their arguments and saying they're not very persuasive. And the final way I think this often manifests is in counter assertions, where either you actually, I think the main way this manifests is to say their argument's not true, or people actually respond in X way rather than Y way for, A, B, and C reasons. But what actually happens is that you've not at all attacked their argument yet either. So say, on the banning cigarettes argument, I argue that no one will smoke anymore as a result of banning cigarettes. And Ello stands up and says, no, people will just start vaping instead. Both of these are, plausible things that could happen as a result of that policy. Neither of them is in and of itself more likely or less likely than the other. And so if you just say that the alternative, which something else will happen, but you don't provide reasons for that, you're just leaving it up to the judges to decide which they deem more persuasive. And if you don't actually respond to the reason someone's given for why something is true, but you just give a set of reasons of your own as to why it's not true, you are equally kind of just leaving the decision on who's more persuasive up to the judges. The solution to any and all of these is that you should just provide better responses to the claims other teams are running. Those responses being A, disproving the logic, so unpicking their reasons and showing why their reasons are not true, making clear, oh, well, they've got this gap in their analysis that means that premise A does not lead to premise C. It doesn't show that the outcome they're talking about actually logically happens. But the second way you can do this is by flipping the argument, which is to say you agree with the premise that something is important. You agree that banning cigarettes or whatever it was I said, less people dying is good, but you show actually that it's more likely less people die on your side than it is likely on their side. Both of those are just much better ways to respond. But generally, when you think about this, you should be thinking about, are the responses that you're giving in debates actually explaining why other teams should lose, or are they just kind of saying things or commenting on arguments in a way that isn't productive? The second problem people have when it comes to poor responsiveness is kind of spending too much time on irrelevant responses and not enough on defending their own arguments from the responses they have received. I think an example of what I've said as the solution here, but sort of the better way of doing this, is that given we have very little time for speech in BP, 7 minutes isn't really very long at all, you should prioritize dealing with the arguments to interfere with your strategy winning, the things that, if true, create some kind of obstacle to your ability to win the debate. So an example where this was done well, again, is the Zagreb EUDC 2014 final, where the member of opposition gives not many responses, but the only responses he gives are ones that help prove a necessary premise of his case, which is that the feminist movement is ineffective at being able to stop military interventions from happening, because that's required for the CO argument to be true. And if it is not true, and they are actually effective at these things, then that doesn't allow the CO argument to work. So you should prioritize taking out arguments that interfere with your strategy winning. And then I would say you should prioritize ways of responding, which take out the argument in its entirety by disproving the logic or flipping it, rather than sort of like, sometimes mitigation is fine, but I would say avoid mitigation if you can when you can do better responses, and avoid counter assertions and just commentary that's not actually rebuttal. These things are not helpful to you in the same way that better responses are. So after the debate, what you should be asking yourself in terms of trying to improve on responsiveness is, firstly, did we sufficiently respond to the other team's argument? And secondly, was there a more efficient way to defeat the other teams than what we did? Did we do something that took too much time? Did we waste time that could have been spent on other things? Or did we, effectively prioritize our time? But if you keep both those things in mind, they will also help you see whether or not you are doing well on your responsiveness or whether you should be working on something else to try and improve at it. To sum up then on that sort of section, The first thing that I think you should hopefully have as a result of that is some techniques for improving your knowledge and solving common problems that arise when people are trying to, win debates, but they're struggling with strategy, with analysis, or with responsiveness. And the second thing you should be able to take away is certain questions to ask at the end of debates when trying to come up with feedback for yourself or trying to reflect on strategy or analysis or responsiveness. Hopefully, as a result of those things, you'll be giving kind of already better feedback to yourself and you'll be able to ask for better feedback as a result as well. Because if you don't necessarily know if your responsiveness was on point, you can ask the judge and they'll be able to give you a much better answer for that than they will for just sort of kind of have personal feedback in general. Last part then is going to be on winning the real debate, which is to say, beyond winning debate analytically, how do you win a debate that is judged by people where there are people in the other teams as well? How do you be persuasive in that manner? So, why is it that people lose the real debate? The first reason is due to lack of clarity. The second is due to poor strategic commentary. And the third is due to poor style. The first, then, in terms of lack of clarity, do the judges actually understand the argument that you are running? Because the problem is, judges have to understand what it is that you are saying before they can credit it, and certainly before they can decide that you've won the debate. But the problem there is that judges are human. They've got other things in their mind. A lot of the time, they're not necessarily paying 100% attention, especially if you're online and you just have no idea, like no accountability if someone is paying attention or if they're on Messenger or something else. And some of the time, they're just not actually very good at debating themselves yet, or they struggle to follow very complex debates. So they've been put in a high room as a reward, or they're just maybe their first time chairing or something, and they're not really very strong at following difficult debates. So, for all of those reasons, clarity is actually a very important feature in being able to convince judges that you should win the debate. The problem people run into in terms of lack of clarity, I think broadly is one of four things. So, the first is having poor structure, which often looks like either not really having a concrete structure as to how you break apart, your framing versus your argument and the mechanisms in that argument versus your impact versus your weighing, or jumping around all over the place between different arguments, or doubling back when you forgot a sentence in your first argument, things like that. All of these are just things that make it much harder to track your speech. I would say structure is something you can work on very easily. Often it is just trying to assign yourself a direct structure and see if you can work on it that way. For whip speakers and things like that, usually trying it like team by team is a good way to attempt to impose some structure on yourself. But the other thing I would say is you'll probably know if your structure is a problem for you if you ask your judges if you can look at their notes. You're going to very quickly see how well they've been able to track you. Because I'd also say most judges kind of flow linearly. They'll be tracking you throughout your speech as it goes on. So if it is the case that you're jumping around, or it is the case that you're kind of jumbling things up in a way that makes it hard to parse out individual points, ask your chair if you can look at their notes, and you'll get a good sense of how clear your structure actually has been. The second problem on clarity is that people just have a lack of signposting. So poor structure is bad but not fatal if it is the case that people do know what you're doing as you're doing it. If you don't have signposting, then it's going to be more difficult. So signposting is that thing that we often say to novices, which is that you should kind of say what you're going to say, you should say it, and then you should say what you said after the fact. But what you do want to do is to make sure you're being very clear at the point where you are running your substantive versus running responsive material. You should be very clear as to when you are running your impacts and you're explaining why this is so important. All of those are moments that you really want to flag to the judges what part of your speech you are at. So I think listing your mechanisms, making sure your lists are very clear, making sure you're very clear when you're moving between pieces of a speech. So first argument before you start your first argument, or impacts, weighing, something like that to just indicate where you are and what the purpose of what you're doing is very helpful to make sure judges are following you properly. The third problem is often when people are talking too fast, such that judges really struggle to track them, or it's difficult to make sure you're actually grabbing the nuances of what people are saying or the specifics of what is coming out of them. That is a real problem that can make you much harder to track. And the fourth is when running overly complex or convoluted arguments. So that's either arguments that just require quite a lot of legwork to be proven, or arguments that maybe are very jargony, hard to access, or arguments that just, are very unintuitive. And so you really need huge amounts of work to be able to convince a panel of them. I would say in general, you are better off if you can make arguments that are simple. Simple arguments are almost always going to be easier to track, easier to sell, easier to convince people of, and you won't run into difficulties of people just not understanding your arguments if the arguments are themselves easy to understand. But the solution overall, I would say, if you are struggling with or think you may be struggling with a lack of clarity, is to work on clarity very deliberately. I think what that looks like is recording your speeches and listening to them back. I did that a lot last summer. It's just helpful to see what it is that the panel are actually hearing because we think a speech is one thing as we're giving it and we write it down beforehand. But it's helpful to know what you actually said and the way it came out because that's going to tell you immediately how it sounds and how it's actually structured, things like that. Another thing that I think is useful, especially if you're running quite complex arguments or maybe you're just not being intuitive in a way that panels understand, is to provide examples or provide analogies to make sure that you're selling your point is very, very clear. And the last thing I would say is to assess and think about your note-taking style. A lot of the time when people have chaotic structure, it's because they have chaotic notes. It's because when they are writing their own notes to debate, their points for one thing are like jumbled up in a million places, and their response to the other teams are jumbled up there too. And it's really hard when just looking at the page to see how you're supposed to structure the speech or how things are meant to be grouped together. So look at your notes and honestly say, are these helping you? Are they hindering you? Are they clear in a way that makes it easy for you to give your speech, or are you having trouble? Because maybe the answer is you need to change your note taking in a way that makes it much easier for you to structure your argument and then to give a very clear speech that allows judges to track it very well. The second problem that you can face in terms of this kind of not winning the real debate thing is having poor strategic commentary. And the question here really is it easy for your judge to explain why the argument you have made wins the debate? Judges have a lot of competing incentives, and they might not even be consciously aware of them at the point where they're making decisions on who's won the debate. But judges want, the fair call, but they also want to get good feedback off of the teams. They want their deliberation to be relatively painless with their panelists. They want their DLiv and their OA to both be under time. They'd really like to not be rolled. And so if it is too difficult to explain why the argument that you've made wins the debate, because it's too complex or it's too weird, or the reason it wins the debate wasn't really explained and you have to think about it really hard and it takes 10 minutes of DLiv to think about and explain, they're just not going to want to do it. And so if it is difficult for them to explain it in an OA, or if it's difficult to convince the panelists that your argument has won, they're also going to be quite unwilling or possibly unable because they can't articulate it very well to do it. So what you really are having a problem with then, or what the problem is that is causing that problem, is that you're not providing strategic commentary on why you should win the debate or why you have won the debate. The solution here then is to explain very directly why your arguments logically must win the debate. I call this spoon feeding. I think it's just the act of very clearly being like, we win for these, and these reasons. Here is why our argument beats theirs. Here is why they lose to us. Just being very clear at all times, giving your judges the exact reasons that you want them to say in the OA as to why you're winning the debate. You also explain the direct implication of every piece of responsive material you provide. So you give a set of response to opening opposition and then explain what that's done to the opening opposition argument. So as a result, opening opposition case is completely implausible. So they cannot be winning the debate on that margin versus our case, which is still standing and is showing a very important impact by whatever metric you've identified. And I think what's also helpful for many people is having some kind of snappy conclusion that sums up why they win. So be it, something like opposition's case is diabolical. It's clearly principally wrong. We win on all margins, propose or whatever. There are people who are much stronger at those specific strengths than me. But I think having something memorable that you're ending on, something very quick as an explanation that your panel can recall as to why you win the debate, also is very helpful in making sure that you do so. I know Park did a workshop with strategic commentary that is likely far more detailed, so I'd recommend checking that out in terms of working on this particular skill. The third problem people have here is just whether or not the speeches they're giving are rhetorically persuasive. And when we talk about style, it's really just have you given a speech that you are able to make your judges want you to win with? When people talk about like scammers or scamming a lot of the time, the debaters who give very nice speeches and are winning on the basis of how nice their speeches are, not on the basis of the content analytically, the thing they are actually identifying is that if you make your panel want to give you the win, sometimes that is enough to give you the win, even if analytically you maybe should do a bit less well. The problem that many people have, I think, in terms of their style as to whether or not it is persuasive The biggest issues are either they're too quiet, especially in person, so that you're, mumbling a little bit. It's hard to hear you properly. You're maybe not looking at the back of the room, so projecting properly at the back of the room. It can also be that they're very monotone, so that they don't vary up their tone very much, or speeches are maybe all kind of very similar length and kind of goes like this, and there's not much variation, and there's not much point when, you end a sentence or anything. That is not super persuasive to judges or to people over 7 minutes, which can be, well, a short period of time for the speaker, quite long for a judge. I also think speaking too fast in such a way that's hard to catch every individual word or every individual thing you say often doesn't give you the air or the space for the things you're saying to land. And finally, sort of lack of imagery or examples, which are often super useful in terms of grounding your impact or showing what things very important. All of those problems can be barriers to you winning debates that you are in. So, the solution when it comes to improving style, I think, is often watching other people who are rhetorically persuasive and reflecting on what they do well. I'm not going to say this list is in any way definitive. It is one I came up with today based on debates I've either seen recently or broadly remember being very good on style. But the following, I think, are all very good examples of style and all different speeches and different ways of being stylish that I think are worth checking out. The first is the DLO speaker in the Black Sea EUDC ESL Grand Final. Maria is a very, very persuasive speaker. She's a very forceful speaker and is very good at making other people sound silly. I think it's a very good skill. The Black Sea Open Grand Final, there's Anna Komen in Prime Minister, Daniela Williams in Leader of Opposition, and Velina Andanova in Deputy Leader of Opposition are all very strong speeches when it comes actually on quite different things. And I would recommend watching them in that order. That's the order they spoke in the debate. But they're differently strong speeches that are all very persuasive in their own right, but are all definitely doing a different sort of thing. Sophie Sheed, Australian debater, is one of my favorite debaters when it comes to style. I think she's one of my favorite just to watch. She's very forceful, she's very persuasive, and she's very good at pointing at specific problems in other teams, which I think is maybe a benefit of 3v3 to some degree as well. But in both the Sydney Open Grand Final last year and in the UNSW Pre-Australs 2024 Grand Final, she gave two very, very good speeches. Uday as well, in the first AF speech in that debate, also a very good speech. In general, his speeches are very good, but that specific speech is good, I think, in terms of being extremely clear and quite funny in the burdens it's pushing onto the other side. And the reasons that those burdens should be listened to are persuasive, partly because they're told in a funny way that you kind of want to believe and go along with in that way. And then a very slightly different style, Tamar in the Zagreb ESL Grand Final. Tamar is a very kind of polished, responsible adult kind of speaker. She is really convincing, but she is slower. She's a bit more, you want to agree with her, you're having a reasonable chat with her almost. But all of these people have different styles, but they are very, very powerful and convincing speakers. And I think looking at people who are rhetorically persuasive, trying to figure out what it is they do well between different speakers, figuring out what they do differently and which one you like better. They're all good ways to start thinking about style and think of it as a deliberate thing that you do, something that you are choosing, the choices you make in words and images and stuff, not just a thing that randomly happens by happenstance. And the second thing I would say is that I think improving style comes from deliberate practice. It comes from things like recording your speeches, it comes from thinking about those things, picking imagery, giving a little bit of time and prep to how you might start your speech, or if there's anything you want to tie into your speech, or if you can sell the impact in a slightly more persuasive or personal way. Giving a little bit of dedication to that is worth it because I think the absence of style can hurt you, especially if other speakers are giving a little bit more thought to it. And so I think then after you give speeches, you should be thinking about how was our style? Was it persuasive? Did we pick good images? Did we maybe have a good intro or something persuasive to why we should win the debate? Did we pick an impact which like did we pick an impact that is itself persuasive and did we sell that impact in a good way? Did we word things in a way that might be persuasive? I don't think style is everything. Like I'm not trying to say you will never win debates if you're not, maximally stylish at all times. But I think that style is not one thing. It's not very simple. It's not like you do this one trick and you'll win a major. It's just a collection of things which make your speeches broadly more persuasive. And I think looking at a range of speakers who do different things is going to give you a good sense of that and a good sense of how to do that quite well. Um, that's all I prepared in terms of this. Sorry, I think I've gone slightly over time. It might be worth stopping presentation because I know I hate answering questions on recorded things, but thank you guys so much for coming, and I hope this is helpful.